Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to all, and happy Valentine's Day to everyone. There are a few items on the work session agenda tonight, but I want to begin just by acknowledging that Southern Lehigh is celebrating Black History Month. Throughout our schools, our students are engaged in all kinds of activities. Our hallways are decorated, some very substantial activities and very much incorporated into our curriculum are taking place during this month. And I just did want to acknowledge that as we begin our meeting tonight. Our second item is our standing item on our work session regarding construction. And our facility committee is meeting tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. To meet with architect David Horn. And the purpose of the meeting is to look at strategies for acquiring both goods and services. There's a number of different strategies for purchasing and identifying contractors and vendors. And Mr. Horn is going to be speaking to the committee on that topic and any other topics related to the facility discussion, again, for a public meeting. Mr. Lissette, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, the only thing I would add is, excuse me, the only thing I'd add is that, definitely for any of the board members that would like to attend to listen to David's presentation, please do so. And for community members, it's advertised, it's an open meeting. And, at this point, we're meeting in the administration building, but I would suggest we could change that if attendance so inclines us to need to.
Absolutely. Yep. Very good. The third item is related to St. Luke's, as many know, in a very public way. In a twice corrected Morning Call article, there was information regarding St. Luke's relationship and Southern Lehigh School District. I'm very pleased to report that President Reinhardt and I had an opportunity to meet with leadership at St. Luke's for over an hour in what was a very constructive, positive meeting. And there was a public statement that St. Luke's and Southern Lehigh agreed to. And I thought, just for the record, following discussions at our last meeting and the very public airing of this issue that took place, that I would just simply read the statement. And that is, St. Luke's University Health Network and Southern Lehigh School District leaders met Wednesday to review the discussions and outcome of the most recent Southern Lehigh School Board meeting, as reported in the Morning Call article of January 25th. The discussions were collegial, frank, and direct. As a result of the discussions, it was agreed by both parties that future dialogue will be open and courteous to further strengthen the bonds that exist between St. Luke's University Health Network and the Southern Lehigh School District. It was also agreed that both organizations will remain committed to ongoing respectful and collegial collaborations as both organizations continue to serve our shared community and our children. And I don't know if there's any questions or not. We move to the next item. The next item is probably one of more substance and more discussion that I hope to have, and that is to talk about how we meet as a board, how we deliberate as a board, and how we process as a board. And currently, we have a very defined structure as to how we meet, where we have each meeting twice a month is an executive session, a workshop, and then a voting meeting. And as I look at it, again, I'm very grateful. A number of board members said, hey, look, we'd like to hear your thoughts on this, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. So I'm going to offer a few. Right? And that is, in the current structure we have, the time structure is what drives the process, as opposed to outcomes driving the process. I say, for example, if we have a 30-minute executive session. Now, that's true if we have 15 minutes of do or 45 minutes of work to do in the executive session. And probably of greatest concern is that of the work session, right? Because we have less than really 1 hour of time for us to work. And we as a board and as a community have many challenging issues to address and that do not always lend themselves to a finite time of 1 hour period. And so let me offer a thought that when we deliberate as a board, we most often do it after a motion and a second, right? And in that context, we've had excellent discussions. A vote is coming up just next. And there's very little time to fully reflect on what is happening, to perhaps ask for more information, or to consider what our colleagues are saying about something, because right away we're then voting, all right? And as far as time is concerned, I'll just do an example, a budget, okay? In a work session that was not time limited, we could perhaps have the auditor come in to present the audit from last year and talk about the financial results of the last year. Then administration could talk about the implications of the audit in the next year's budget. Board members could then have an opportunity to question about the implications of the audit in next year's budget, say on taxes and programs. And then they could offer a list of questions that might want to take place, or offer insight or direction even to administration as we're moving forward. And I would suggest that board members would have a more powerful and a more meaningful input into moving forward than they ever would if it's just, again, a time-limited discussion where we're rushing through, or if we're doing something just before a vote is to occur. And so I would see the value of the work session actually rising above the value of the voting session, because it would be in the work session where we would be able together, without a limit of time, put together powerful ideas as to how we move forward, and then have an opportunity to reflect on them and perhaps ask for more information or tell administration to do this or that or clarify points as we move forward to the voting meeting. Also, with respect to the community's time, the work session, I would say, would begin at 6:30. We wouldn't need necessarily an executive session prior to, where board members could simply come in. Now, let me be clear. We would still be posting the agenda in advance. It would be online. People in the community would know what it is we're talking about. If we had presentations, we'd get them up there just as we always do. And we would come in at 6:30 and begin this discussion. I would foresee 2 periods for public comment, where someone can come in the work session and say, look, I know you're talking about this, here's my thought. Or after the presentation is done, well, you didn't think of this, right? Or they may come in and say, look, I have a concern unrelated to what's on the agenda tonight. We're getting shorted on chicken nuggets, right? And I don't know what to do, right? So whatever the case is, the public would have this opportunity to participate. And if there was a pressing need for an executive session, we could have it after the meeting or not. But if there was a 10-minute executive session issue, we could finish the meeting, go into executive session, spend 10 minutes. Or if there was an hour need for a complex matter in executive session, we could also accomplish it then. Then when we come to the second meeting of the month, which would be the voting meeting, all right, we would come in for a 30-minute executive session, because oftentimes when you're voting, there may be a question on personnel. I think it's a good thing to have the 30 minutes. Then instead of starting our meeting for the public at 7:30, we would be able to start the meeting at 6:30. There would obviously be opportunity for public comment. Certainly, right, just because we had a work session couldn't mean that after a motion and a second, we wouldn't have an engaging conversation. So it doesn't mean that we no longer have that opportunity, but I would suggest that we would be in a position to have a better informed conversation as we are doing it. And then with the meeting starting at 6:30 instead of 7:30, our community members would likely be able to be home at a more reasonable time, even in those situations where the meeting extended for some time. Then, a couple points. We would continue to advertise all meetings as meetings for general purposes, which means that if there happened to be an emerging issue for a work session, I'll just use the example of, say, during hiring season, we have identified some great people and we don't want to wait too long because they'll be getting jobs someplace else, teaching in other districts. We would then reserve the right to, as we always do, post the meeting in advance, have all the agenda items there, and then in the beginning of the meeting, take formal action on hiring these great teachers, and then go into our work session on whatever topics we would care to have. So we would reserve our rights and our opportunities to take action, but we would certainly try to take action at our voting meetings as opposed to our work sessions, unless, again, the issue was emerging. And there would be, I think this is actually increasing transparency because the public would have an opportunity to hear more of us. And as far as posting, anyone who wants to check to see what's on an agenda, they could do so in advance. So again, that's my thought. It's not a model that I've thought up. This is a common practice in many places. But I thought I would just throw that out for the board's consideration and reflection. And if it's something that makes sense to the board, maybe in March, we could consider it. So again, thank you. And I would hope that people would talk. I think, Dr. Serene, you may have.
I just had just so I understand, basically every meeting for public consumption would begin at 6:30. Whether or not we have an exec session beforehand would vary, and we would always have the voting every other, essentially, unless we have a need for it sooner. My only request would be, I think it sounds like a great idea to try. It would be new for me, and I think, we could certainly try it and see if it's more functional and works out better for us. The only request I would have is maybe we decide ahead of time, because it sounds like for the voting meetings, you would still do exec for sure at 6 o'clock because the need would probably be there. I would just ask that maybe we know ahead of time or decide as a group, maybe tonight, that if we're going to need an executive session for a non-voting meeting or a work session, maybe we could also do it at 6, just so we don't have to do it at the end of a potentially long work session. Just throwing it out there. I feel like it might work better, but.
I'd like to say I'm pretty much on board with this concept. I've been concerned or frustrated a little bit by the amount of time at which the analyses and discussion of these topics is limited. And if we're to have a preparation period, the meeting before, I think that would give the opportunity to have additional things happen with respect to these subjects. We have many things to discuss and review and clean up, and I think this would be helpful conceptually.
Just in support of the concept, this is a structure that worked well in the past when we had workshops before board meetings. It gives a little more time because you don't have an end time to those presentations, which I think is a great idea. But you're right, it worked very well for the board when we had a topic, a workshop, a presentation before we were going to vote. So in the past, we would have a workshop and a presentation, and then the following meeting, those items would be looked at or voted upon, or maybe not. Maybe they were long-term presentations. And I think returning to that would be great. So I support that fully because I think it is a very good format. Give everybody more time to gather information. So
when did that change, by the way? When did that change? Getting back,
really,
you said getting back to it, so I was just wondering.
So
Recently.
yeah, so what the format would be is the workshops there was a curricular workshop, and then there was a buildings and grounds type of workshop. And I forget if the first meeting of the month was curricular, I think it is, and the second meeting of the month, the workshop was focused on facilities. And so that anything you would be hearing about would be a full meeting or two ahead of time in that workshop session, and we'd move into the voting meeting. But it was atypical for us as a board before unprecedented times of COVID and punting and turning on a dime, and, you know, much as the entire district had to do that. The issues that we would be voting upon would not be, it was rare for them to be the same night we were hearing the material or talking about it. So I think it's a great format. It worked well then, I think.
I mean, it's different though, this format than what we did. I mean, previously we had not unlike what we're doing tonight, just in a slightly different order, where you had workshops before every meeting. Obviously what's proposed here is a 2 meeting a month, or how it works out. One's a workshop, one's a voting meeting. And I think that's a better format than either the prior format or this hybrid. It's not much different than the prior format. I certainly endorse it. It certainly, I think, sounds like a better way to go about it. I agree with Steve's point that, having done this for a long time, you know, when you have to, and to your point, Dr. Mahan, when you have to vote on something that you're just hearing some information, not that you don't have the agenda in advance, and not that you don't have some of that, but obviously it's good to be able to reflect upon other people's comments at the meeting. You get to reflect upon people's comments from the community, and then you can ask questions, you know, over a 2-week period of the administration and get those answers. So I think it certainly sounds like a better format. As to the executive session, I would differ from Dr. Serena on that, in that I think having kind of the one before the voting meeting, I think makes sense, and it's time limited. But I agree with you, having again done this for a long time, almost always we need more time in executive session. Of course, we don't want to keep the community waiting. We want to be prompt for our meetings, but then we often, you know, really compact what we're talking about and don't maybe get all the questions out we would otherwise. So I certainly understand the reasons why it's helpful to have it beforehand, but I like the idea of having it after for the one meeting, because of the time limitation is not there. And I think we probably, while it's not fun to stay here after a meeting, I get that. The hope would be we'd start the meetings earlier. The hope would be, as we move into maybe have a little bit of new start here with getting back to some education themes, and you know, if the pandemic lets us do that, perhaps the time won't be at the same level of constraint that it has been. So,
I mean, I'm willing to do it after also. I just was throwing it out there. I mean, the other option too is if we're not done in the, you know, if we need more time, there is that option always for any meeting to have executive session after. We've done that in the past. I think the other good point too about breaking it up with respect to, you know, doing the voting meeting separately, I think it would allow people who aren't able to participate on a given night that we're talking about a topic, for example, from the community, at the workshop, you know, for word to get out and for people to have the opportunity to comment on it through, you know, written form, through emails, or show up potentially at the next meeting, you know, when it will be discussed, because they weren't able to make that last one, even though they saw the agenda too. So, yeah, just throwing that out there as well.
So
Consensus
well,
on
it
this?
seems that's the consensus. Now, because we still have a meeting in February, we'll just keep the next meeting in February like this one. And then we'll shoot for the first meeting in March to be a work session. And administration will take it upon ourselves to make sure that we do value your time, and that we will make sure that those meetings are put to good use on very important emerging and planning issues. Because again, it's good to talk about planning in some of these things as well. So I thank the board. I thank the board for that. And the last topic I have is that of the calendar. And there's no action, you know, using the kind of the same idea. I thought, well, there's no voting on the calendar tonight, but we hope to have it on the agenda in later in February. The calendar is very similar to what we've used in the past. The only change from the last cycle, when the Christmas holiday was on where it was, is that all the schools in Lehigh County are starting the break a little bit earlier. So in order to be in line with the other schools in the county and in line with the Career Center schedule, we've moved it there. And then really the big substantial difference is that we've had here lots of half days. we've been running at about 6 half days. And the thought that I had, we've knocked it to 3 in this calendar, with the idea that while those days have been put to good use here from an organizational point of view, they often will present challenges to parents at home, particularly those who are struggling, to get to work or to find childcare, or sometimes they may have to stay home or miss hours, right? Or have children at home with less supervision than might be ideal given those circumstances. So we thought that in recognition of those challenges that some of our families are facing, we would reduce the number of half days from 6 down to 3. That's a big change. I know Mr. Dimick had another thought on the flexible instructional days, but let me pause now and ask if there's any concerns about changing from 6 half down to 3.
Not a concern changing from 6, well, just a question, not a concern changing from 6 to 3. 2 questions, really. Am I reading this correctly, that in the proposed calendar for November of 2022, elementary students would have early dismissals on 3 days, but secondary students wouldn't? Am I reading that correctly? So there would be days when elementary would dismiss early, but secondary would not?
Dr. Trinkle, do you have that is true?
Is that?
Yes, that is true.
Okay. Then my question for that would be, you'd mentioned, and in recognition of families who have difficulty with childcare and working families, I completely think that we should always, as much as we can, think about those families in our scheduling. This, to me, sends up a red flag, because I think some people in our community rely on secondary students to perhaps help take care of or watch or get off a bus or provide a snack or something like that on those half days. And when secondary and elementary students dismiss both on a half days, families are able to utilize students in our community to help watch those elementary students. Even so, just like on an early dismissal day for ICE or something, secondary dismisses first. So if a parent or a guardian can't get home in time, at least that secondary child on the block is going to be there to kind of help collect, or So I would only ask about consideration for that. If our focus is to recognize those families, I would look at how that helps, or
Let us
perhaps.
think about that.
Okay, that was yeah.
Just a comment. I mean, this is not new. We've been doing this for better part of 15 plus years.
Yes.
Because it's for the parent-teacher conferences that are scheduled at that time.
Yes, absolutely. But the students are still at home when the parent-teacher conference is reducing the number of half days. I'm completely on board with. I would just say, since we're at a time of flux, let's consider, and if the fluctuation in the decision is to try to, in recognition, to help our families, let's just look at that a little more closely, because that's all I'm saying. And my secondary question was then, because of the
So
teacher.
would you recommend that the teachers do it in the evening then? When would you like it to take place?
No, I'm just saying that secondary, that was my second question. So my first question was, if secondary is in school for a full day and elementary is in school for a half day, since we're trying to address those concerns and try to help our families, do we want to look at whether or not, and how to manage that? Just, is that helpful to families? How can we help families? Let's look at that. That was just a question I had, but it leads into my other question, which is, yes, conferences were scheduled during half days, because we could schedule parent conferences during the teacher working day and the teacher contracted day. My other question is, just how do we have, how are we accommodating conferences in general? And how does that coincide with how the teacher contract is written and the teacher workday? And are we going to have conferences then in the evening, or how does that, are we asking our teachers to come in the evening? How are we going to accomplish those same conferences, was my second question.
And I'll defer to Dr. Trinkle, but we're not changing anything in the teacher contract. Those obligations will remain the same on everyone's account. I think there will be fewer opportunities for parent conferences at the elementary level. Kids will be in school longer, but I think the evening ones are still going to be run. And so while there'll be limited opportunity, there still is that evening, and that is the trade-off.
There's still going to be only then one evening conference
Correct.
day.
Yes.
Not multiple evening conference days to replace the opportunity.
No, absolutely not. No, there will be less
Less time
opportunity
for conferences.
Yes.
Okay, is the answer to that?
Yep.
Thanks, that answers my question. I appreciate it.
I just wanted to comment if you compare the proposal, which I certainly support, to what happened this year, there will be 3 days in which, so there's really the same number of days in which there are half days for the younger students when the older students still go to school. So it's actually really no difference.
Oh, no, it's no different at all. You're right. I'm just saying, if it's, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's no different. However, I'm just saying, if we're acknowledging, if we're making the change to help families, I'd like to really look at that decision and how it helps families, and if we could change that, or, just, that's all.
And we have time. I mean, this is just the preliminary draft.
And I really appreciate the look at
Yeah.
reducing the number of days that parents have to struggle for childcare or figure out all of that. My only comment was, if that's our goal, I was just suggesting that I know secondary kids are used to kind of fill that gap, and if we're really looking at that, maybe we could help a little bit more.
Sure, no,
That's all.
that's fine. That's exactly what we want. And then the other thing is that we have these flexible instruction days, the FIDs, and the calendar says that our first set of snow days, I think the first 4 or 5 of them are snow days, just that, right? And then afterward, we have these FID days where kids would be home, but they would be online and there would be instruction and it would count toward the end of the thing, right? And we had a thought expressed that that I'm sympathetic to, really. So why do we ever go back to online? Because we know, if the pandemic has taught us one thing and one thing only, that our kids are best served when they're with our teachers and with each other in the buildings, right? So when we only get 180 days of instruction, right, a loss of one is a big thing. And I'm not saying a loss of one, it wouldn't be accommodated to some degree with instruction from home, but it's not the same, it's not as good. And so the question that we want to say is, do we want to just go back to, as we've always been, snow day's a snow day, and if we're home, and we'll make it up when we can, when it's in person. Now, the only drawback to that, there's no drawback instructionally, because our kids with our teachers are the best possible model. But if we were to have really, really bad weather, and then graduation and vacations that have been planned maybe over the spring break, that type of thing could be impacted. And so that's the balance. And I look for the board's direction and thought as to how best to handle that issue. I know many districts now, they start with the instructional days first day out. And I definitely wouldn't think that's how we should approach things here. But the real question is, after 4 or 5 days of being out, in acknowledgement of some of the scheduling challenges, is it something we want to consider for our families, and perhaps most of all for our seniors in that year where you have the 10-day blizzard in March or whatever it happens to be. So I throw that out for your consideration because, again, it's a fair question, and I look for your thoughts.
I like the flexible instruction days, personally. I think that they serve a good purpose, and we all know that when the end of the year comes, the last thing in the world you want is those days that are all tacked on because we had some bad weather. And as much as everybody hates virtual, and yes, in person is absolutely better, I also think that nobody wants to go to school longer or have spring break truncated because start taking away days, start adding days to the end of the year. All we ever heard about any of that was complaints, and this kind of solves that. And yeah, it's days that the kids aren't in school, that they're online, but I think it's a nice compromise to adding the days on or losing holiday break days.
I mean, I think there's potentially, maybe we could achieve a balance between the two, not have them all be flexible instructional days after, and certainly open to discussion. But I think the part of the problem with tacking them all on at random times, as we've done in the past, and or at the end of the year, is that then it's not really in line with when you're learning it, right? If you tack it on at the end of the year, realistically, a lot of kids probably are going on that summer vacation, or are missing those days because of a prearranged trip for spring break that they can't change. So then in the end, they don't really get the instruction for that topic that they would have been on, right? So, I mean, and I'd be curious to know what the teachers think about it, because I think it has to be in line with when you're learning the material. At the end of the year, we know what kind of happens. So.
And just to give a little bit of a history, we have been up against, on those few harsh winters where you have, a blizzard of 10 days, there is the financial impact of looking at, we have a venue scheduled, we have certain things scheduled, we're up against it, end of teacher days as well. And then we don't necessarily have a vehicle to get all of our student hours and student days in. In a very recent history, the board and the district had to decide how it was going to roll the dice, whether or not it was going to risk the charges of the state to fine us for not having enough hours, especially for the senior graduation, or whether we were going to, look at different venues or plane tickets, or just, there's a slight financial aspect to consider there too, and why keeping virtual days, while not ideal, keeping them as an option, I think, is a nice safeguard to have, even if we don't use them, except in extreme cases. And I agree, I'd like to hear what the teachers think about how it would best flow with their teaching of the material, especially with, at the high school level, things like AP tests. And while I don't want to teach to a test, the pressure of PSSAs, while they're still here, is real, and getting instructional days before certain benchmarks. I don't know, I don't feel like a lot of learning took place in June when I was sitting in a desk, or as a parent when my kids were. So I'd like to hear from the teachers how they'd like to organize that as well.
The previous board had discussions of that this last year. And I believe the order was put in place because it was the thought that everyone needs a day off. It's a snow day. I think that was part of the context of that. And so I don't know what the logic was there versus now. It's,
That would still stand for the first four. The current, what is currently seen in the calendar is the first 4 days are snow days, traditional snow days. We're just talking about once we creep into, right, Dr. Mann? We're just talking about once we creep into beyond that,
Right.
Where do we strike a balance between getting
Yeah.
instructional days in, and that's all. And I'm okay with the flexibility as opposed to tacking them on to the end.
Yeah, and just,
You need a superintendent who does not call snow days when it's overcast. I'm 1 for 2 so far here. I gotta throw that out.
yeah,
So,
you're batting
Hall of
500.
Fame numbers, right?
yeah, that's
I
right.
think, what was it, that Friday, I was kind of wondering, but we were supposed to get freezing rain
Yeah,
earlier.
yeah, I put a little sunscreen on
That-
as I went out that
Yeah.
afternoon.
Yeah.
So,
It was lovely until about 5 o'clock, and then we finally got a touch of freezing rain.
Yeah.
The one thing that's kind of come across clear on the emails that we've received, that from a disruption, the instructional days can be disruptive, because as parents have learned, when there's online instruction, especially for the younger students, there needs to be someone there to help proctor the learning. So from a disruption standpoint and being sensitive to that, I would rather defer away from it, simply because if a parent's working remotely at home, it's disruption that they have to take time off of work to attend to the educational needs. And if they're working outside the home, they're going to have to take time off of work or find someone to be there to proctor in their absence. So it really, while it's a wonderful thing, it also presents a challenge to parents to find the right individual to cover the needs of the child if we use that to make sure that they're engaged in the education and getting what they need from it. So I think a snow day these days has a lot more merit than being online learning.
well, for
For
sure.
a variety of reasons,
Yep.
even beyond the initial 4.
I agree with Bill. I just think the value from having children in class, to your point, Dr. Mann, I think has been, well, it's commonsensical. I think it's been proven over the last year or two where we've experienced both. So I think by far, children are learning more when they're in school. We have 180 days, whether it's the half days you just discussed or whether it's these days here, each one's precious. I agree that the days in June are problematic, but it's the last 3 or 4 days in June that's problematic. So it's not, once you add 3 or 4 to the end, it's not now 7 days, it's still the last 3, it's just that they've moved. So I don't know that you ever get away from, I'm not too old to forget that I didn't learn anything the last 3 days of school, but I don't see that as the problem here because there's always going to be 3 last days of school. So I suspect we could, in the event something, we get our, once in 100-year storm winters, I suspect we can be nimble enough to figure out ways around that. But it would be my hope that going forward, we would lean towards the posture of not having instructional days.
For example, and we could rework this calendar to add in-person makeup days during I would throw out, for example, if we were to have, a very serious storm in March and we found ourselves behind, we might want to say that Thursday, the 6th of April and Monday, the 10th of April would be the first, like day 5 and day 6. All right. Now people say, well, I had a vacation plan, but we would have to tell them that, look, these are makeup days. We would put it right on the calendar. And then
we've done that, Dr. Mann, just so you know, that has been a practice in this district. So that would not be foreign to people. It's actually a relatively new, with the state moving towards giving us this opportunity. It was only then that we moved here. We always, as you're indicating, would tell people this is the first one to go, this is the second one to go. And I think that was generally well received.
All right.
Can I ask a question? We're making a decision here for the school year when the teachers and the parents at home are the ones that, I almost feel like maybe we can put out a survey to the teachers and maybe even a survey maybe to parents. Like, I feel like this isn't something that we should do without asking. Like, the teachers know what they're doing and they know what's more disruptive to them and what flows better for them and what will work better for them. Let's ask them. And I know, like I said, in the past, when we did that, when we would start chopping away at days for like spring break or President's Day or whatever, we would get inboxes full of complaints from parents because we were taking away their days and they had plans for those days. And now do they take their kid out of school or we had a lot of complaints about it. And again, I'm not saying that we don't do it. I'm saying we should ask.
Yeah. And I think that will be the case for sure. I mean, that is the argument where people will plan to go away over the spring break. They will plan to hop to the shore for senior week right after the the very first instant that it's possible. And to the extent that there's any uncertainty in the calendar, there will be, I totally agree. And so I think the issue is very well defined and it will be, a matter of saying, does the solution justify the problem it will cause, right? Does the outcome cause? And for those who are traveling, if they lose the 6th and the 10th in April, that will be a problem for them. But if we use 2 instructional days, flexible instructional days, instead of those 2, there will be far less complaints, but there would also be a loss of value of instruction. And that really is that's what the community as represented by the board has to really kind of determine. But it's very predictable. Right now, it's okay to do that until your plane is booked and then it's a problem for you when it comes up. So I think that you've defined it very well and it's just a matter of what we want to do.
Yeah, I would request to ask, let's ask the instructors and the teachers.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we could. But the issue, I think it's unlikely we're going to gain insight. Now, there may be insight in scheduling and end of the year things that we have to look into for sure. But the core problem is going to be that people who want to get away, who have planned it, are going to be, wanting to just go and do it. So, but yet they would be going away on instructional days, flexible instructional days too. So if we used all of our days, right, but so we would use, if we used 4 or 5, then, oh, that's true. They would just be on the day that they have. No, that's right. Yep. Yep. So is there a thought on what we'd like to see on the calendar? Again, the nice thing is we're not doing it tonight. We have until next meeting. But
I mean, I certainly would favor, the quality of instruction with in-person education over complaints from those who, schedule, as long as we're upfront. I think that's the most important thing, is being upfront, communicating to the community, as we've done. And I think as our calendar does. I mean, when we schedule, and I'm somebody who, schedules some of these vacations, and, that's on the family. It's our responsibility.
And we could certainly ask for input right now. We've got two
Well,
teachers
sure.
going to represent the teachers.
Sure.
I'd love to hear. I mean, this is a workshop, so we could certainly ask for their input right now.
Happily.
Please, please.
I'm going to speak on behalf of myself and myself only. I actually really like this year's format. I love the idea of giving the kids and staff a break for those first couple days, especially when they're surprises. But then, the idea of having a flexible instruction day, I think is fantastic as well. And the one thing I will say is, this is just my opinion, I think a flexible instruction day in February is actually possibly even more valuable than an in-person day in June, because you're in the groove. It's a gloomy day, it's snowy, it's icy, whatever. To have the students log on and do school from home for 1 or 2 days, I don't think is a real big issue. I see a bigger issue, to a couple of points of going further into June. We have done, as Jeff spoke to, we've done the pulling a day here or two from the holidays. It does become an issue, in a lot of ways, and it becomes a bit of a teacher issue as well. If a teacher decides, let's say over the spring break, they're going to go Thursday to Saturday or Thursday to Sunday, and then Thursday does get pulled. The issue is that teacher cannot then choose to even take a personal day, even if something is already booked, because contractually we can't take one of our 2 personal days attached to a holiday. So it is a nice little thing, and you can say, well, we've got the summer to look forward to, but when you just want to go away for a 3-day weekend or something, it is just a little something to look forward to there. I'm very curious to see how the rest of this year plays out. We've only used 2 of our days so far. Maybe we'll use the other 2. Maybe we won't. We're already in mid-February. So we'll see what happens. But I would love to see how this plays out. Maybe before making that final decision. But of all years, and I've seen it done every which way, this is the one that I think is the most favorable, to be honest.
Can I just add to that too? Also, and again, I'm speaking through the lens of we're both secondary teachers. So I understand definitely the concern at the elementary level. So from secondary though, I'm looking at it as AP testing dates are set, Keystone testing dates are set, PSSA testing dates are set. So again, listen, we 150% believe that in-person instruction is best. But for a teacher trying to prep their students for AP testing or Keystone, even that online day in a February, March is crucial, especially if we end up losing, 5 days. That's 5 days behind of AP testing. That's my one thought. My second thought, and I'm not 100% sure, but I know, for example, seniors have to still meet a number of days and hours. So my concern there is we set graduation as we need to very early in the year, because we can't schedule a graduation. We can't change graduation date. So that's the other issue. If we were to have now this winter's mild, we had last year, and it was much easier to go online last year. We were online, I felt like even when we were in hybrid, we all stayed home every other day, which there's a cap this, now with 5 days. But that's a concern of mine also. If we have a bad winter, and we only have the 4 snow days and not those 5 flexible instruction days, are we getting ourselves into an issue with graduation dates? So those are just things, again, that some initial thoughts.
That's the voices of 2.
Right. And I was gonna say, and the bottom line is you will never please everyone. So you will never.
That That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Right.
100%.
Right, but so just, I guess, there are pros and cons, but the 5 flexible instruction days does give us time during the school year in the heart of it, preparing for those tests and things like that.
While we're on in-person, I do want to commend all of our teachers. Attendance has been excellent, and especially today, right, where it's a holiday. We have great teachers who are showing up every day to make sure that kids are served at a very, very challenging time. So thank you for being here and your presence among kids. So again, we were a little worried about today as we look at attendance and kids are coming in here or there. And why were we worrying at all? Because we had just absolutely a great loyal staff coming in and answering the bell, and we're very, very proud of that. Today also happened to be the first day where we had 0 positive cases in the whole district. First time, I think, in, I don't even know when, maybe ever in a long, long time. So thanks to our teachers and our staff, things are going, and we have a lot more subs now too, thanks to some work that's been going on in the HR office. So thank you to our staff.
I was just gonna say, for those reasons, thank you to our teachers for sharing that information. And although you are only secondary, and thanks for pointing that out as well, for the reasons you mentioned, right now, without further information, I am in favor of utilizing virtual days the way we did with this current school year calendar. It's just my personal opinion. Not addressing those half days. I'm just talking about the structure of virtual days.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, that's my opinion.
I remain concerned about elementary folks. These are secondary, and I certainly absolutely believe that virtual days work much better in that format. But my concern is, as you always say, people that are reading by the 3rd grade. And it was my experience, having lived through virtual with an elementary student, that the value there is minor at best. And so I think that would be my focus on the issue of getting kids in front of their teachers for our youngest kids, because I don't think it works for the elementary student. And I'd like to hear from the elementary teacher. Not that I think that's valuable feedback. I appreciate that, and that's their, as you said, and I appreciate that feedback. I'd like to hear feedback on specifically from an elementary teacher whether they feel their instruction online is as valuable as their instruction not online. And I think we know what the answer is to that.
Well, sure. And again, I'm going to say the same thing I said before. That is pretty much understood. And it is really as valuable as the parent's ability to be there with the child. And that varies on short notice. So that's, again, the other side of it. So again, I think we have a very well-defined and clear challenge as to what to go, because there's no right or wrong answer here. I mean, there's good justification for either way to approach it. And that being said, maybe we can get some, I mean, I hate to say, where does the board want to go, but where does the board want to go with this? Because we're very happy to do it either way, because there's a sound basis for either side.
Well, I also think there's the unknown of how long, like, we were out of power 2 years I don't know if it was in a row, but we were out of power at our house. So a lot of times people in the community, am I on? Hello? Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of times people in the community lose power in areas that others don't. So they can't obviously dial in or get in, and it could last, like I said, 2 years. We stayed in a hotel in Scranton for a week, and another time we were able to stay home with no power for a week, but we couldn't get internet. So I think it's kind of a tricky gray area.
It's tricky.
Here.
It is tricky and gray. I'll agree with that.
We're both in October.
I think at this juncture, I'm agnostic on this, so.
There you go.
Taking a stand.
That means it's 4-4, right?
We've been doing these things for years. I mean, decades have gone by where we're, have these challenges. So whatever I find out, I think at this juncture,
I just said at this juncture, I think it should be whatever your plan is. And I think either way is probably acceptable. We've been dealing with snow days for decades. And I think I'm kind of agnostic on it, like I said.
Dr. Mann, we're not obligated to utilize all 4 of these flexible instruction days, right? We could say would use 2 or something like that as a
We could
potential
use-
compromise.
Right, so it's all up to us.
Okay.
And so now we
Just a
can't go
maximum of
beyond,
4.
what do we have, 5 of them?
5.
Yeah, so there's a maximum, but there's no minimum. So if we want to say the first 4 snow days, the first 3, the first 5, whatever it happens to be. So that's another, you just push that barometer any way you want, but you can't go past 5. Then once you hit 10, then you automatically have to start making them up.
And can we also leave it to chance, meaning, leave it at 4 snow days, leave it at traditional snow days at the end, or, taking up days within the calendar itself, unless you notice that we're hitting a certain point where we're going to run into trouble because of the terrible storm that we have been hit with, and potentially splitting it so it's not.
Well, sure,
full-
and we could
'cause
put
it's
on the bottom.
It's at your,
Yep.
Discretion, right? Like we could,
Right.
because obviously it's clear that you value in-person education. I am reassured, based on what you've said and what, my impression of you. So I'm sure that in those situations you would, I would value your discretion.
Well, and what we could do is, and this is not uncommon, at the calendar, we could put a note that this is subject to change based upon emergency conditions. And at any point during the year, if we see these things unfolding, then we could come back to the board and say, well, now that we've had 2 weeks of being off from school, what is it?
I want to do it a little sooner, but yeah.
Well, right. But I mean, we could put a little acknowledgement on.
I don't want to lose the instruction time before
Right.
certain benchmarks for secondary, but at the same time, it's critical for elementary to be in person. So I think trying to balance the two, because we're never going to make everyone happy with anything. That's clear. So I think just trying to balance it so it's not set up. Okay, we're definitely going to use the 5 full flexible instructional days.
Okay.
Do that, right? So maybe we could just, if they're certainly falling at a point in the curriculum or so forth, then we utilize them as flexible. If not, then, after a certain point. I just think maybe it's a compromise
So,
for all interests, perhaps.
How about this? We'll consider how we are best using the half days, as was suggested, and let us think about, we'll never have less than 4 snow days. So that's the bare minimum, because even there's some discomfort, I think, with that as it is. And let's see if we could put in some language that allows some flexibility based upon emerging circumstances to see how we react. That brings it back to the board, because one of the things I think in the school code, it really is the board that's supposed to be doing the calendar. I don't think superintendents are, it's a big kind of a thing for boards to be doing, not superintendents.
That's correct.
Yeah.
The board has to approve the calendar.
Right, and so we'll do this calendar, I'll do my best, along with Dr. Trinkle, who's put in a lot of work, along with the other administrators on this. We'll try to address some of the concerns that were expressed tonight. We'll send it out to the board for your review, and then we'll come back and see if it works in February. And the nice thing is, if it doesn't work on February 28th, we have better ideas, we'll just push it and do it in early March. We want to get this semi-formalized because we want to give it to our career technical school, LCTI, because it's good for them to coordinate schedules so we're all going to school at the same time. But I think we're really not talking about the holidays. We're just talking about we're down to the fifth day. So we'll call this as it is, pretty much good. And then we'll see if we can't make it better and come back in February with it.
Are you not talking about the holidays with reference to, like, this is the first day to go, this is the second? I was just confused. I'm not suggesting that. I'm not in favor of that. When you're saying we're not talking about the holidays, we're pretty good. Are we past the point of considering?
No, we're not having a discussion. Well, let's come to school on Thursday the 6th.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying.
So
those bookended days are still.
right. So
Okay,
if we have perfect weather, I think we're all pretty good with what the calendar says right now. But we're really talking about if weather's not perfect or emergencies come up, how we do it.
Perfect. Thanks. Thanks for the clarification.
All right. So that's so that'll be our job. Okay. And that, at 7:30 precisely concludes the presentation.
Ready to move on?